stop scrolling for a second. Because what you're about to hear isn't just another rich family drama. It happened inside a house with 40-foot ceilings and not 1 ounce of warmth in it. A house where a woman raised a hand against someone who couldn't fight back, in front of 300 witnesses who did nothing but film it. But by the end of that night, the person everyone thought held all the power had lost everything that mattered, and the person everyone had overlooked walked out holding more than anyone in that room could imagine. Stay until the end, because the last 5 minutes of this story change everything you think you understand about it. The Whitfield estate looked like something built to be photographed, rather than lived in. 60 rooms, a private art gallery, a ballroom with a ceiling painted like the Sistine Chapel by someone who clearly had more money than restraint. That night it was lit for the engagement party of the decade, celebrating Nathaniel Whitfield, a shipping and logistics billionaire, known for being unusually quiet for a man of his wealth, and his fiancée, Isabel Cross, a woman whose smile could light up a room and whose temper could empty one just as fast. Everyone who worked for the family knew which version of Isabel they were likely to get on any given day, and most had learned to disappear before finding out. In the kitchen, a young woman named Renata Ose moved between trays of champagne with the kind of careful precision that comes from doing a job you cannot afford to lose. She was 26, working nights as household staff for the Whitfields while finishing her final year of nursing school, during the day running on coffee, 4 hours of sleep, and the quiet math of exactly how much her younger sister's leukemia treatment cost each month. Renata had been at the estate for just over a year. She kept her eyes down, her tray steady, and her opinions to herself, because staff who spoke up didn't last long in that house, and she needed this job the way some people need air. She wasn't supposed to be noticed. That was the entire skill of the job, moving through a room full of important people as though you were furniture, with good posture. But that night, fate wasn't interested in her staying invisible. It happened near the grand staircase, under the largest chandelier in the house. Isabel, several champagne glasses into the evening, was showing off her new engagement ring to a circle of admirers when Renata passed carrying a tray of drinks. A slight shift, barely anything, sent one glass tipping, and a few drops of red wine landed on the hem of Isabel's ivory gown. Most people in that room wouldn't have even called it an accident worth mentioning. Isabel called it something else entirely. Her face changed instantly, the practiced warmth of a hostess disappearing into something colder and sharper. "Do you have any idea what this dress cost?" she said, loud enough that conversations around them stopped. Renata apologized immediately, voice already shaking, reaching for a napkin, trying to fix what didn't need fixing. But Isabel wasn't interested in an apology. Something in her had already decided this was about more than wine. She reached out and grabbed Renata by the wrist, hard enough to leave marks, and in front of everyone, slapped her across the face. The sound cracked through the ballroom louder than the string quartet playing in the corner. The music stumbled to a stop. Someone gasped. Several phones came up immediately, not to help, but to record, because in rooms like this one, a viral moment was worth more than a person's dignity. Renata stood frozen, one hand rising slowly to her cheek, tears burning in her eyes, not just from the sting of it, but from the humiliation of being struck like a misbehaving child in front of 300 strangers who did absolutely nothing. And that's when the front doors opened. Nathaniel Whitfield walked in, still in his overcoat, keys in one hand, and stopped dead in the entryway of his own home. What he saw didn't make sense to him at first. His fiancée standing with her hand still raised, a young woman in a black uniform pressed against the staircase railing, cheek reddened, and a ballroom full of people watching in silence like an audience at a performance. Nobody wanted to admit they were enjoying. "Isabel," his voice was quiet, but something underneath it had gone very still and very cold. "What did you just do?" Isabel straightened her dress as though nothing unusual had happened. "She ruined my gown, Nathaniel. She needs to learn some manners." "She's a person," Nathaniel said. "Not something you correct." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others kept filming. Nathaniel crossed the ballroom in long, deliberate strides and knelt beside Renata, close enough now to see the faint outline of fingers still visible on her wrist, the redness spreading across her cheek. His jaw tightened in a way none of his business partners would have recognized. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and his voice had none of the polished distance he was famous for in boardrooms. Renata shook her head quickly, too afraid to say anything. That might cost her the job her sister's treatment depended on. But Nathaniel wasn't looking at her like an employee who had made a mistake. He was looking at her like a human being who had just been assaulted in his own house, in front of everyone he knew. "Someone call a doctor," he said, standing, his voice suddenly sharp enough to cut through the frozen silence. "Now!" Isabel laughed, an incredulous, champagne-brightened laugh. "Nathaniel, are you actually making a scene over the help?" The word help landed like a second slap, this time across the whole room. Nathaniel turned to her slowly. "Say that again." Isabel, emboldened by years of never once facing consequences, didn't back down. "You heard me. She's staff." "This is literally what staff is for." Murmurs spread through the crowd. A few guests looked away, uncomfortable. Others, people who had grown up inside the same gilded, entitled world as Isabel, nodded along like this was simply how things worked. But not everyone agreed. Nathaniel's grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, 91 years old, and the woman who had actually built the shipping empire from a single-leased dock 40 years before her grandson was born, rose slowly from her chair near the front. The room went quieter still, because everyone in that family knew that when Eleanor stood up, she was about to say something nobody would forget. "I built this family's fortune with these hands," Eleanor said, holding them up, weathered and steady despite her age, "loading crates at 4 in the morning before any of you were born into comfort you didn't earn. I did not raise my grandson, and I did not build this company so that a woman with more jewelry than character could remind me what money is supposedly for." She turned to Renata, her expression softening completely. "Come here, dear. Sit down. Someone get her water and ice immediately." The staff, who had spent the entire evening pretending not to exist, suddenly moved as one, and for the first time all night, the house felt less like a stage and more like a home. Isabel, sensing the room turning against her, tried one last time to recover the narrative. "Nathaniel, you're seriously choosing a maid over me? Over us, over everything we've built?" Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression finally settled, like a decision that had been circling for a long time finally landed. "We haven't built anything, Isabel. You've spent 2 years redecorating houses I already owned. I think I've known that for a while. I just didn't want to admit it." He slid the engagement ring, still catching the chandelier light on Isabel's hand, into focus with his eyes, then said quietly, "I'd like that back, actually." Isabel's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: disbelief, fury, and finally something closer to panic, as she realized every phone in the room was still recording, and this moment, not her engagement, was the one about to define her online reputation for years. Security escorted her out 20 minutes later, dignity considerably smaller than her exit demanded. The party didn't end. It simply changed shape, guests slowly gathering not around the billionaire, but around the young woman sitting with an ice pack against her cheek. People who suddenly remembered their manners now that cruelty had a consequence attached to it. Nathaniel sat down across from Renata once the room had calmed, and for the first time that night spoke to her not as his fiancé's staff, but as someone he was genuinely curious about. He learned she was in nursing school. He learned about her sister. He learned that she had worked 3 jobs for over a year without ever once complaining to anyone, because complaining wasn't a luxury she felt she had. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived at Renata's apartment, not from Nathaniel personally, but from the newly created Whitfield Family Foundation for Working Students, an initiative Eleanor had insisted on setting up before her grandson had even finished processing what had happened that night. The letter covered the remainder of Renata's tuition, and quietly, without fanfare, covered her sister's ongoing medical costs as well. There was no press release. Eleanor made sure of that. Kindness performed for cameras, she told her grandson, isn't kindness. It's marketing. Renata finished nursing school 11 months later. She now works in pediatric oncology, in the same hospital wing that once treated her sister, who is healthy today and studying to become a nurse herself, following the sister who never once let their circumstances define what she believed she deserved. Nathaniel never remarried in the years immediately following that night. He did, however, quietly restructure how his household staff were treated across every property he owned: fair wages, healthcare, tuition assistance for anyone studying while working for him. When a reporter eventually asked him what had changed his approach to running his companies and his homes, he gave a short answer that later became something of a quiet motto inside the company. I used to think the people who built the loudest lives were the strongest ones in the room. I learned that night that strength usually looks like someone quietly getting back up after being knocked down and choosing not to become cruel because of it. Here's what this story is really asking you to sit with, and I want you to really think about this part because it applies to every single person watching, not just billionaires in mansions. Character isn't revealed in the moments you plan for. It isn't revealed in interviews or wedding vows or carefully curated photos. It's revealed in the split second nobody is watching closely. The way someone treats a waiter who got their order wrong. The way someone speaks to a cashier at the end of a long shift. The way someone treats a person who has absolutely nothing to offer them in return. Isabel had money, status, and a room full of people who would have laughed at every joke she ever made. What she didn't have when it actually mattered was character. And here's the lesson worth remembering. No amount of wealth, beauty, or status ever fully covers for the absence of that. Renata had nothing that night except her dignity, and she held onto it anyway, quietly, without demanding anyone notice. And that's the second lesson buried in this story. Dignity isn't loud. It doesn't need an audience, and it doesn't need permission from the room to exist. Renata never once raised her voice, never once begged, never once let humiliation turn into bitterness. She simply kept working, kept believing her circumstances were temporary, and kept showing up for her sister every single day. That is not luck. That is discipline dressed up as quiet endurance, and it is far more powerful than anything money can buy, because it cannot be taken away from you the way a bank account can. And think about Eleanor for a moment, the grandmother who built an empire loading crates at 4 in the morning. She didn't stay quiet because staying quiet was comfortable. She stood up in a room full of powerful people because the values she built her life on mattered more to her than anyone's approval that night. That's leadership. Not a title, not a boardroom, but the willingness to say the uncomfortable true thing while everyone else is filming instead of acting. So if you take one thing from this story, let it be this. You will have moments in your life, smaller than a ballroom, quieter than a scandal, where nobody is watching and nothing you do will ever be posted online. And in those moments you get to decide who you actually are. Choose kindness in the moments that cost you something, not just the moments that make you look good. Treat the people who can do nothing for you exactly the way you'd treat the people who can do everything for you, because eventually life has a strange way of putting all of us in a room where the truth comes out, one way or another. And when that moment comes for you, I hope the person you've quietly been all along is someone you're proud to have revealed. If this story moved you, hit like, share it with someone who needs the reminder that character matters more than money ever will, and subscribe for more real stories of justice, courage, and quiet strength winning in the end. Drop character over money in the comments if you believe the way we treat people who can do nothing for us says everything about who we really are, because Nathaniel Whitfield walked into his own home that night expecting an engagement party and walked out having learned exactly who he almost spent the rest of his life with and exactly who deserved his respect instead.